Howdy all, grab yourself a drink, it's time for some PathOfExile discussion. Once every now and again, Grinding Gear Games run a Q&A, where they take people's complex questions about game mechanics and give in-detail answers to them. One of the things that is a constant truism within PathOfExile is that the game is very, very, very precise and literal with its wording. If there's two ways that you can interpret something, normally one of them will be precisely correct and the other one will be, oh yeah, I can see why that makes sense. In that case, it's almost always the precisely correct answer that is correct. In any case, I want to go through all of these Q&As and give you a bit of a sense as to what information was revealed there. For veteran players, there'll be a few things you didn't know in this, and for newer players, I expect there'll be a lot of questions that you won't have been able to work out the answer to yourself, because there are so many skills in PathOfExile and so many interactions that it's nearly impossible for any one person to memorize them all. So the first question was, how does the Seder skill on large elemental cluster jewels interact with Skitter bots? For those of you that don't recall Sadist, it grants additional elemental damage if you've chilled an enemy recently, plus stacking increased damage if you've ignited recently, and additional stacking damage if you've shocked an enemy recently. This can be a total of 60% increased elemental damage, so it's a pretty big deal. It's one of the most point-efficient sources that you can get on the extended passive tree through cluster jewels. However, it's not something every build can use, and hence the question about skitterbots. Unfortunately, it's the skitterbots themselves inflicting this chill and shock. It's not you, and as a result, you have not inflicted these ailments, and therefore you are not going to get the benefit. Second question relates to Elemental Overload. Elemental Overload is a keystone that causes your skills that have dealt a critical strike in the last 8 seconds to deal 40% more elemental damage with hits and ailments, as well as having a drawback. Now, this question asks, what if you hit an enemy multiple times with Ignite, and after the first hit, Elemental Overload procs? So you critically strike on your second hit. In that case, the first Ignite's damage has already been locked in. The second Ignite is probably bigger, and it's also procced Elemental Overload. And so what's going to happen is that the Ignite that deals more damage, which is almost certain to be the second one, is going to be the one that matters. So if the first hit was 1,000 damage and was not a critical strike, the second hit was 900 damage but was a critical strike, and so Elemental Overload was on for it, then that 900 damage will be scaled to 1,260, and as a result, this one will deal 26% more damage per second with the Ignite. But under normal circumstances, only one Ignite can be on an enemy at a time, and so the more intense one, the second one, will become dominant, and the first one will still stay on the enemy, just in case the other Ignite got removed somehow, but will have no effect. Next is a question about the mechanics of the Summon Reaper skill. So Summon Reaper summons a Reaper that makes a whole bunch of different attacks on enemies, and it doesn't like working with other minions very much at all. In fact, it has a tendency to eat them, including eating expensive animated guardians. So the question was, how does the Reaper minion decide which of your other minions it will eat when it decides that it's hungry? Is it random, or is there a priority of some kind? The answer here is quite complex. They could have just said it's an equal chance for all of your minions, but they wanted to be more precise because that would be a little bit misleading. So here's the way that the Reaper minion works. It has an AI table. This AI table gives it a number of different actions that it can take and a weighting for each of these. There are two different consume another minion skills that the Reaper has access to. One of them has a low weighting and is available whenever the Reaper has not eaten another minion recently. This can happen even if the Reaper is at full life. The second one of these skills is also conditional on the Reaper not having eaten a minion recently, but it's also conditional on the Reaper being below 75% life. At that point, it's going to go and pretty aggressively eat your minions because this one has a much higher weighting. Also, the number of nearby monsters has an impact. So each minion is going to be a valid target for the skill and is therefore going to increase the chance that the Reaper is going to spend its time eating your minions. But also each monster that's visible that the Reaper could attack is also going to decrease the chances that the Reaper is going to spend its time eating your minions. Ultimately, it just wants to attack someone. It doesn't really care whether it's friend or foe, although it will be happier to attack a friend whenever it becomes damaged. There are no variations in weighting based upon the minion type, etc., but the Reaper cannot eat immortal or untargetable minions, so no skitterbots and no raging spirits. Can it eat phantasms? Yes, it can. Also, are phantasms from Summon Phantasm support affected by other support gems? Yes, they are. Do all splitting projectiles from Sniper's Mark come back and hit the original target when using a returning projectile skill like Spectral Throw, or do only a few do so? Now, the answer here is definitely not all the way that the original poster of this question thought it might have been. The original poster thought that if you hit a monster with a returning projectile and then it split from that target, then every single one of those returning projectiles would damage the monster on the way back. Instead, they only damage the monster on the way back if they hit it, because they're going to be chasing your character. They're going to try to return to your character or to the totem that originated the attack, or the location of the mine, or whatever it might be that the split came from. Additionally, once the monster has been hit by one of these returning projectiles, it becomes immune to all of the rest of them, even if they hit it on different frames. So that definitely doesn't work the way that the person who asked the question thought it might. Next question was, are non-damaging ailment effects based upon the base damage of the inflicting hit or the total damage? They're based on the total damage actually taken by the enemy. And this is a big deal when it comes to players taking damage and having resistances. If you have very low cold resistance, you're going to be frozen, you're going to be chilled a lot. If you've got very good cold resistance, then you're going to be much more resilient against chill and freeze effects. And that's because of this exact effect. The same rules apply to enemies as apply to us. Why does skill effect duration increase the duration of some minion skills such as offerings and not other minion skills such as skeletons? Now this was actually the player asking the question being incorrect. The duration of skeletons is affected by modifiers to skill effect duration. Why does Divergent Hatred, so for those of you that aren't aware, a Divergent Hatred is you and nearby allies have 0.5% increased movement speed while on chilled ground per quality on Hatred. Why does this not apply the movement speed buff to the player if we use something like Arctic Armor, Frostblink, etc.? The gem does not specify that it has to be chilled ground from an enemy, yet it only seems to work if it's chilled ground from an enemy. Now this was an interesting one. Chilled ground only does things at all to enemies. It effectively does not exist at all for allies. This is something I didn't know. I've never interacted with Divergent Hatred, and so I didn't know that this interaction was that way. I would have thought it was going to work the other way, so I'm glad that that was answered in this Q&A. What exactly constitutes your chilling areas? Do skitterbots count? Specifically, the 4 things listed in the reminder text in-game: chilled ground, creeping frost, frost shield, and vortexes. Skitterbots are not one of those things, and Skitterbots are not one of these things, and if the chilling skitterbot instead worked by creating one of those effects around itself, that would be the skitterbot's chilling area, not yours. More generally, how is credit for causing ailments counted when the effects aren't directly caused by you? Example, Corpse Pact and Impulse's Broken Heart. The elements in that situation are directly caused by you. Corpse Pact is your passive skill. It causes you to inflict chill and shock. In a non-standard way to be sure, but you are still inflicting those ailments. Enemies entering your chilling areas in general does not count as you chilling them, nor as anything else chilling them, they just become chilled. I can't give a more detailed answer because I'm not sure what you mean by credit for causing ailments. What I think the original poster was asking there of GGG was for considering whether you have inflicted a chill recently or whether you have inflicted a shock recently for an effect like the Sadist Cluster Jewel Notable. How does that work? And that has not been answered there. Is the corpse cap shared between all things that generate corpses, or is the cap unique to each skill? For example, do the corpses of Desecrate contribute to Unearth's corpse cap? These skills each have their own limit. Now this was one of my favourite questions. What happens if you simultaneously have a 100% chance to flee and a 100% chance to taunt? This is a classic example of PathOfExile being extremely literal. Most people would think that a monster being taunted and a monster being caused to flee, that these would cancel each other out in some way. What actually happens is quite different. The monster becomes taunted, it gets the taunt effect on it, which means that it can't see anything other than the source of the taunt. So we'll assume for a second that that's the player, and at this point, the monster will be razor focused upon the existence of the player. They won't be able to target anything else. Then additionally, unless the monster is immune to flee for some reason, it will flee. So it's going to flee away from the player at this point. Taunt doesn't prevent fleeing, even though you might think that it might just from a plain English expectation from the word. Taunt prevents the targeting of objects other than you. They effectively become invisible to the taunted enemy. Fleeing from you is an action that targets you, not something else. One interesting consequence of this that I want to test out just for a bit of a laugh at some point. If you're standing quite some way away from a decoy totem and you have a skill that causes a chance to flee on it, you could inflict the fleeing status on the enemy. Then once it starts running away from you, you could put a decoy totem past it. Once it gets taunted by the decoy totem, it's then going to still want to flee from whatever has its aggro, but that aggro is going to swap over to the decoy totem because it's going to lose awareness of you. At that point, it's going to run directly away from the decoy totem, which if you're positioned in the right way, might be right towards you. I'm sure that you could play some silly games involving this and Blade Vortex if you wanted to have a little bit of a laugh playing pinball with monsters. Next question relates to poison mechanics. Does the modifier given by Master Toxicist, which is poisons you inflict during any flask effect, have 20% chance to deal 100% more damage? and the unique bow Darkscorn, which is 20% chance for poisons inflicted with this weapon to deal 300% more damage. Does this apply to poisons applied by skills used by minions, totems, and mirages? So this is one of those cases where the wording on these mods is different and it may not be immediately apparent until you go back and reread them. And this is that poisons you inflict during any flask effect have 20% chance to deal 100% more damage. That's very different to poisons inflicted with this weapon deal 300% more damage. So your minions inflict their own poison with their own skills and their own weapons, and so they cannot benefit from Darkscorn. But totems, mirages, traps, and mines all use your skills, which are affected by your stats, and for attacks, they use your weapons as the base. They will be affected. Next was a question about curses and doom mechanics. This is one that I think many veteran players will have already known, but it's a very useful clarification because there will be many people that didn't know it. If I cast a curse, example flammability, and it's gaining doom, and then I recast it on the same target, does the doom counter reset, or is the curse duration refreshed but the existing doom counter remains and continues to count up if possible? Now the new hex will replace the old one entirely because they cannot both exist. Each hex has its own doom. And so this means that if you've got a flammability curse on an enemy at 15 doom and then you apply a new flammability, back down to 0 and it's going to start creeping up again. What's the radius of profane boom explosions? 22. Does it scale with modifiers to area of effect? Yes, it does. So that's a very important factor there that I think a lot of people did know, but that is definitely worth keeping in mind, that occultists can get quite a bit of AoE on the character, and getting profane boom to be even better than it normally is very much possible there. The next question is seeking clarification about the occultist. You cannot be stunned while you have energy shield. Say I take a hit that would fully deplete my energy shield, can this stun me? Or does the hit have to land when I already have 0 energy shield in order to be able to stun me? It's the latter. You are unable to be stunned when you are hit, so that hit cannot stun you. Next question relates to Corrupted Soul, the Keystone, and Petrified Blood. With 40% of damage delayed only be applied to half the damage received, making it 20%. Now, Petrified Blood is interesting. This is a common misconception. People think Petrified Blood's delay applies to damage. Instead, what it's doing is applying to life loss. So Petrified Blood does not delay or modify damage taken. It changes only the loss of life, which is the sort of final step in the chain of working out how you're going to take damage. So if some of the damage causes you to lose things other than life, such as energy shield or mana, then Petrified Blood doesn't care about that, doesn't interact with that damage at all. But assuming that you've got sufficient energy shield to go with Corrupted Soul and no effects like Mind Over Matter or guard skills that cause you to lose other things instead, half of the damage taken from hits will cause you to lose energy shield and half will cause you to lose life. Petrified Blood will only change the amount of life lost. Next question relates to fire damage over time multiplier. Do multiple sources of fire damage over time multiplier stack additively or multiplicatively? I think there's a 3.19 teaser in this one as well. So all modifiers to fire damage over time multiplier in the game are explicitly additions to the base value. They use plus to show this. No multiplications occurring, and therefore they stack additively with each other. However, this is the part that I think might be a teaser. Any hypothetical future modifiers giving increased/reduced or more/less fire damage over time multiplier will follow the standard way these modifiers work, adding a percentage of the total base and added value to itself, and stacking additively or multiplicatively with other such modifiers respectively. So ultimately, it looks like there are some plans perhaps to introduce some future modifiers that are being teased here. I can't see why this would have been mentioned otherwise, although who knows, maybe they just like being extremely precise at GGG. So the next question relates to Valyrian, this unique ring, which has the line stun threshold is based on energy shield instead of life. So your resilience to being stunned is based upon your energy shield rather than being based upon your life. Currently, how does Valyrian interact with things like the Agnostic Keystone passive skill and Mask of the Stitch Demon? So firstly, Mask of the Stitch Demon doesn't affect maximum energy shield, which is what matters for calculating stun here, so there's no interaction here. With the Agnostic, or any other case where you have 0 maximum energy shield, the stat on Valyrian currently does nothing due to a bug which doesn't handle a value of 0 correctly. This will be fixed at some point in the future. Do they work like Chaos Inoculation does regarding stuns and elemental ailments, where the effect was based upon how much of the relevant stat there would have been before this effect was applied? And the answer is no, that behaviour is very specific to Chaos Inoculation. Next question relates to totems and the cruelty buff. Can totems or your traps or your mines benefit from the cruelty buff? Totems, traps, and mines use your skills. Now, if you have cruelty, your skills that are supported by cruelty support will deal more damage over time. This is true regardless of whether those skills are used by you or by your totems, traps, or mines. If a totem somehow gained the cruelty buff itself, that would do nothing because even if it had skills of its own, these wouldn't be supported by cruelty support. Does Bloodthirst support and Mirage Archer support interact in any way? If the player is at low life, does the Mirage Archer get that added damage bonus? Bloodthirst support makes your skill deal more damage when you're on low life, and so Mirage Archer, because it uses your skill rather than its own skill, it gets that bonus. There is a totem skill tree mastery. 5% of damage from hits is taken from your nearest totem's life before you. What happens if this damage would overkill the totem? So let's just change this into a specific scenario. You suffer a 2000 damage hit. You currently have a totem that has 30 life left and you have this mastery allocated. Do you take 1900 damage and the totem takes 100 damage, killing it and being 70 points of overkill damage? No. You take 1970 damage and the totem takes the exact amount of damage necessary to kill it, because anything which says damage is taken from something before something else can only work for as much loss as you have of that thing. Excess after the first thing is depleted must be taken from the original thing, just like how normally damage is taken from energy shield before life, but a hit which deals more than enough damage to deplete energy shield will take its remainder from life. Why don't damage over time affects shatter already frozen enemies? This really is a thematic decision GGG have made, and it's just because shattering something requires an impact to break the ice. In what order are armor and resistances applied when your character has the Transcendence Keystone? So Transcendence reads, armor applies to fire, cold, and lightning damage taken from hits instead of from physical damage, and you have minus 15% to all maximum elemental resistances. So for each damage type, if you have a resistance which applies to that damage, it applies first. Then if armor applies to that damage, damage reduction for that type of damage from armor is calculated, and then that is applied to any remaining damage. Any additional damage reduction is also added to that from armor, but this currently only exists for physical damage. This means that resistance is lower damage before it's compared to armor to work out how much reduction armor applies, and if armor is applying to multiple damage types, that calculation and reduction happens separately for each of them rather than once for the total damage amount. Ultimately, this is the most favourable way for players for this interaction to work, given that it's only players currently that can have the Transcendence Keystone, and this is part of the reason that Transcendence in conjunction with Lawweave has been quite good in recent leagues. Next question was, can Bone Shatter's self-damage be converted, physical to cold for example, and can it critically strike? The answer is no and no. It cannot be converted because self-damage does not come from your character or your skill's stats. If it did, all of your increased and more damage modifiers would also apply to it, and the first time you use Bone Shatter, you would go splat. For similar reasons, it cannot crit, but stats on you can affect the critical strike chance of hits that you suffer. So despite the fact that Bone Shatter cannot roll a crit, in theory, if there was a future stat that caused all hits you take to be critical strikes, this would apply. When is a character dead? Can you be below 0 health and then a mechanic instantly gives you health back on the same frame or server tick? Now this is an example where GGG have answered the question in a very literal sense. I interpreted this question to mean, if you're at 100 life and a monster deals 1000 damage to you, but you also instantly gain 1000 life on that same server tick, does your character end up dead or alive? However, the answer that's given is dead simply means having 0 current life. It's not a separate state, just a shorthand name for checking whether life is currently 0. If you have gain 1 rage per hit up to once per second from a cluster jewel, and you also have it from an axe mastery, will you now gain up to 2 rage per second? And the answer fundamentally is yes. These limitations don't care about each other. They're entirely independent. And the final question was, can monsters that become untargetable, such as burrowing bugs and devourers, and which have the Soul Eater modifier, eat souls while they're untargetable? Now the answer to this is 2 parts. Firstly, being untargetable does not stop eating souls. However, the monsters you're describing are doing a lot more than merely becoming untargetable, and in general, something which is burrowed away will not be able to eat souls until it returns. That's the end of the Q&A session that GGG did today. I found it quite interesting going through this myself and having a bit of a think about some of the mechanics that are outlined in it. A number of these are sort of corner cases that won't come up very often in gameplay, but some of them are things that come up quite a lot, such as the questions related to how Transcendence works in conjunction with armor, and are just generally interesting to get authoritative answers on so that we can confirm that things work the way we thought they worked in many cases. These are definitely really interesting to participate in, and I do hope that GGG go through some of the other unanswered questions, which included a few that I put in, and give some more answers from this. So hopefully they will do that, and if they do, I will try to get another video out about it, or at the very least I'll put a community post out to give you a bit of a heads up that it's happening. Anyway, that's all I've got on this. May your Varlorbs have interesting results, and I will see you around.